When James walked in on the first day of my philosophy class, he seemed to be trying to make his 6'7", 300-pound frame as small as possible. He hunched his shoulders, pulled his arms and legs as tightly into the desk space as possible, and avoided all eye contact with me and the other 14 students in the class. Weeks went by before I heard the sound of his voice, and then it was only privately after class one day when he confided in me that it had been decades since he had been inside of a classroom, and he was terrified about this new experience. But it wasn't just the time outside of the classroom that had robbed James of his self-confidence. It was also that these years had been spent in one of the most unforgiving environments in our society, a maximum security men's prison in the United States. The very same place where James was right now reading and writing about Plato and Dostoevsky and John Stuart Mill. James was enrolled in a philosophy class I was teaching at Stateville Correctional Center, where we would gather for 3 hours each week to discuss a range of ethical questions, both old and new. I'm a philosophy professor at Northwestern University, and I've also been teaching in prisons and jails for the last 5 years. I learned about the value of education at an early age. I spent long hours playing with my sister and lots of grasshoppers, while my mom sat through classes and exams at our local community college. She was a single mother, raising 3 children entirely on her own and working multiple jobs. Yet she filled our kitchen with conversations about the works of Freud and Jane Austen and Thomas Hardy. I saw as she gave up sleep to earn an associate and then a bachelor's degree, and I watched as she navigated a world ill-equipped and often hostile to single mothers with superhero levels of wisdom and courage. Those years burned in my mind a single fact about education. It is uniquely empowering. As I became an adult, I was determined to bring that power to others, and so I became a teacher. And that's how I found myself in a windowless, cement-floored room in Stateville. As the weeks turned into months, James began to lift his head, to look at his classmates squarely in the face, and to occasionally raise his hand and share his thoughts with others. Near the middle of the term, I invited one of my colleagues at Northwestern, the award-winning writer and journalist Alex Kotlowitz, to lead a nonfiction writing workshop in my class. My thought was that some of the most empowering tools we could give the students would be the skills to tell their own stories. During the workshop, the students were asked to do a short in-class writing exercise. Discuss a memorable moment in your cell. After about 20 minutes of writing, the students were asked to share what they had written with the other students. One wrote about battling a roach infestation, another about compulsively cleaning his cell, still another about the profoundly isolating nature of incarceration. But each had a distinctive, compelling voice. In fact, we were so moved by what the students had written that we proceeded to work with them for the next 10 months, with their pieces going through more rounds of revision than we could track. In the end, The New Yorker chose 5 of them for publication, and WBEZ turned 8 of them into a podcast series for NPR. James's was chosen for both. When I heard about this, I already had a new class of students, so I had to deliver the information to the cell houses. When I told James the news, he at first seemed puzzled, as though his brain had lost the ability to process information that was celebratory. Somewhat frustrated, I reached through the bars of the cell and grabbed his arm. "James," I said, "this is the New Yorker. Most of us would trade our firstborn for a publication in there." After this slight exaggeration, James seemed to understand. His experiences and his ideas were being heard across the nation, far beyond the walls of the prison where he had spent much of his adult life. And with his towering frame completely upright, he flashed a smile that unequivocally conveyed accomplishment. In my years of teaching in prisons, I've had many students like James who undergo a radical transformation in the classroom. But one question we might ask is why? Why does reading philosophy and poetry and history change people behind bars in such dramatic ways? One answer lies in what I call the prison education paradox. Prisons are in some of the darkest corners of our society, and yet despite, and sometimes even because of this, the brightest lights shine in those classrooms. The first strand of the prison education paradox is that prisons are shockingly dehumanizing spaces, but education is deeply humanizing. Life behind bars involves handcuffs, leg cuffs, restraints, strip searches, and cages. People who are incarcerated are often referred to by their ID number or their cell number. They're often reduced to the crimes that they've been convicted of committing. You're a murderer, you're a rapist, you're a drug dealer. The cells, where they spend the bulk of the hours in the day, are just large enough for bunk beds, a toilet with a sink over it, and a couple of property boxes. If both cellmates stand up at the same time, they are quite literally bumping into one another. There are no curtains or doors, so the most private aspects of their lives are on full display. My own students are allowed in the yard twice a week, and for many of them, this conflicts with the time of my class. This means that they forfeit sunshine and fresh air for talking about the nature of morality. The reason they do so is simple but important. The classroom is the only space in a prison where you're a person rather than a prisoner. Empirical work shows the power of the classroom. Those who engage in college and prison programs have been shown to live more meaningful lives, to feel more human, and to have higher self-esteem. Prison education has also been shown to break down the racial and ethnic barriers that are often the cause of tension and violence in prison, significantly improving interpersonal relations. But there is also the evidence staring you in the face as a prison educator. When you connect with another person's mind over the power or beauty of an idea, it becomes impossible to deny their humanity. Two of my students, whom I'll call David and Frank, were formerly leaders of the white supremacist gang in the prison. After decades of interracial violence, both inside and outside of the prison, they now found themselves in my classroom with 14 other students, the rest of whom were African American or Latino. In the beginning, relations were chilly at best, thick with tension at worst. While David and Frank sat up in one corner of the classroom away from everybody else, the other students were very careful to carve out their own separate space. But within just a couple of weeks, David and Frank were not only sitting next to their classmates, they were swapping drafts of papers and trading jokes. Near the end of the term, they were all debating Michelle Alexander's thesis that mass incarceration is the new Jim Crow. Her claim that the criminal justice system is the latest means of subjecting people of color to social domination. David and Frank pushed back against this thesis. Economics drives incarceration, they argued. Poverty leads to prisons, not racism. But the mere fact that they were able to subject a thesis regarding something that had wreaked such havoc in their lives to criticism by their classmates showed the extent to which they were all being shaped by the life of the mind. The second strand of the prison education paradox is that prisons are places of almost complete stagnation, but education is deeply transformative. We often hear talk of letting people rot behind bars, a sentiment made into reality as our penal systems moved increasingly towards punitive policies and practices and away from ones that are rehabilitative. Programming of all sorts was slashed in the 90s, with college and prison programs suffering the harshest consequences. In 1994, Congress passed the federal crime bill, denying Pell Grants to people who are incarcerated. The results were devastating. Whereas 350 prisons provided post-secondary educational opportunities in the early 90s, this number dropped to 12 a decade later. This left millions of people sitting in cells all day, every day, for years, sometimes decades on end. But while prisons are places of stagnation, education is transformative. Education has been shown over and over again to be the most effective way of positively intervening in the criminal justice system. A Bureau of Justice study showed that there is a 76.6% rearrest rate for those who are released from prison within the first 5 years. But for those who participate in post-secondary educational opportunities behind bars, the recidivism rates are dramatically lower. 14% for those who earn an associate degree. 5.6% for those who get a bachelor's degree. And 0% for those who get a master's degree. And prison education programs have also been shown to significantly reduce violence behind bars. A study of an Indiana prison, for instance, showed that there were 75% fewer disciplinary infractions for those who participated in college and prison programs compared with those who did not. Such transformations often begin with a new sense of self and with what is possible. In his application for our program, one of my students, Andre, wrote, "As I sit here taking the first steps towards completing this application, I detect a familiar feeling in my gut, doubt. That old friend I've known so intimately in my life asking, what gives you the audacity to believe you can obtain a Northwestern University education, or that you even deserve it after all you've done?" Andre grew up in Evanston, though in the part of the city over which Northwestern University cast what he calls a demarcating shadow. His only contact with the university was working in Sargent Dining Hall as a busboy and dishwasher for minimum wage. His last memory of the outside world was being led out of Sargent in handcuffs by 2 Evanston police detectives, past a row of students whose faces were filled with promise and direction. Now, decades later, Andre is himself enrolled in Northwestern University classes at Stateville. That familiar feeling of doubt has given ways to ones of hope and determination. The third strand of the prison education paradox is that prisons are isolating, but education is community building, often extending far beyond the walls of the prison. Prisons are cut off from society, occupying what is sometimes called the geography of nowhere, so that both the spaces and the people are invisible. Voter disenfranchisement is widespread in the United States. Only 2 states, Maine and Vermont, allow incarcerated people to vote. This means that prisoners are quite literally denied a voice in the democratic process. Elected officials can ignore them and their concerns, while the US Census Bureau counts prisoners as residents of the location of the prison rather than their home communities. This shifts representation in Congress away from towns and cities with urgent needs to communities whose jobs make mass incarceration possible. Isolation is also a regular feature of life behind bars. Over 60,000 Americans are in solitary confinement, spending between 22 and 24 hours a day in their cells. Those who spend this many hours in their cells, sometimes for decades on end, are often driven to the brink of insanity. They experience delusions, engage in desperate acts of self-mutilation, and attempt suicide at alarming rates. So how do we bring people back from this geography of nowhere? If prisons are isolating, Prison classrooms are not. Ideas demand to be shared, both inside the classroom and outside of them. One of my students, William, spent decades on death row, where he was neighbors with John Wayne Gacy for a while. I first met William when he did maintenance in the back of my classroom. He would be emptying the trash, and he would be lingering, trying to absorb as much of the content as possible before being called out by a correctional officer. One day after class, he stopped me and asked me if he might have a course packet and do the assigned work, giving it to me when we passed in the hall and taking the class by correspondence, so to speak. After getting a course packet into his hands, I was stopped the next week by another person in the prison, and then by another, and then by another, each one asking me for the course materials. After my class ended, my students passed their course packets all over the prison to their friends, bringing to my new class stacks of handwritten assignments, asking me to read and grade all of them. The spread of knowledge cannot be contained, not even by prison walls. Studies show, for instance, that the children of the incarcerated have experienced tremendous benefits from college and prison programs, offering a chance to break the intergenerational cycle of inequality and incarceration. Parents who participate in college and prison programs not only provide a model of academic excellence for their children, they also develop crucial skills that enable them to help with homework and guide future decision-making. Perhaps the most unexpected strand of the prison education paradox is that teachers often end up learning far more in the classroom than the students do. I've been teaching philosophy for 20 years, and during that time, many of the questions I ask in my classrooms come up over and over again. Is the death penalty morally permissible? What is the nature of injustice? Is torture ever morally justified? While I've had students raise insightful and compelling points about these issues, nothing prepared me for having 3 students in my class who had spent decades on death row, or 2 who had falsely confessed to murders that they didn't commit, or 2 who had been tortured by police officers. My Stateville students breathe new life into philosophical questions I've been asking for the entirety of my career. Abstract questions of morality and justice take on urgency as concrete ones, affecting the lives of the very students who have entrusted me with their education. And this happens across disciplines and topics. A recent discussion of The Handmaid's Tale in the prison, for instance, had the students drawing connections between the tightly controlled lives of the handmaids in Gilead and their own lives behind bars. A conversation about the Declaration of Independence had some of my African American students asking where they could be found in that document. And a conversation about food production had some of my students asking how they could be ethical and healthy consumers from behind bars where they have such limited options with respect to their meals and diets. In fact, the Stateville student has so transformed me that I've devoted much of the last 5 years of my life to prison education. I saw firsthand that we don't need more prisons, we need more and better classrooms. And so I founded and am now the director of the Northwestern Prison Education Program, which is the only program in the state of Illinois offering a full undergraduate liberal arts curriculum to people who are incarcerated. Now, students in Illinois in prisons are taking chemistry and math, economics and Asian studies, playwriting and history. With the tools of books and pens and ideas, we aim to transform the landscape of the criminal justice system in the state of Illinois. The lesson that my mother taught me long ago, that education is uniquely empowering, I've learned all over again in the Stateville classroom, but from a new angle. Education changes people. It has brought new purpose to my life, and it has changed the lives of my students. James, who walked in on the first day of class trying to be invisible, has now been heard across the nation through his writing. If you'll listen, I'll let his words tell you what is possible, even in prison. After a long day of landscaping work, I walked into the cell house and stood outside my cell, waiting for the gallery officer to let me in. Leaning against the bars, I noticed something moving in the back of the cell. I couldn't tell what it was because it was hiding behind the steel bunk bed. When the officer opened the door, I walked straight to the back and moved a laundry bag from the wall. To my surprise, it was a bird, a robin or wren, I'm not sure. I'm 6'7" and 300 pounds, and when the bird caught sight of me, it undoubtedly feared for its life. It scurried away, taking cover under the bunk bed. Its little legs moved so fast that it looked like the Roadrunner character. It found safety between two gray property boxes. I couldn't help but laugh at its cartoonish ways. I lay down on the cold concrete floor and reached under the bed to grab it, but it hopped out of my reach. As I lay on the floor, it made its way to the front of the cell and jumped on a slot between the bars. It perched for a moment there. I sat up and admired its beauty. Its beak was bright yellow. Even its brown plumage, amid all the prison gray, seemed colorful. Sitting on the bars, it no longer seemed afraid. It barely moved, just its head swiveled from left to right and back again. It seemed so delicate. Its little black eyes were no longer looking at me. Instead, it appeared to be trying to figure out which direction to fly. I hoped it would find its way out of the building, so I waved my hand, shooing it toward the door, but it flew further into the cell house. For a few minutes, I felt like I was somewhere else. It was a small crack in a routine that sets my life every day. My encounter with the bird brought a rare moment of pure joy, and so I've held on to this small memory. 10 years later, it still makes me smile. Thank you.